Hello, and welcome to another episode of the We Build Families podcast. This is a relationship podcast that's dedicated to building strong families and strong communities by using principles of the Bible to help us reflect the image of God in our everyday life. I am Pastor B, your host, and on today's episode, we're going to ask a very interesting question. How do we love the family that we can't stand? I'm sure everybody has that one family member. Could be a few people, could be everybody, right? That you know that you're commanded to love them, but sometimes it's like pulling teeth. It's some of the most difficult. It's one of the more difficult commandments in the Bible. So we're going to talk about that, the family dynamic and how difficult it can be sometimes to love to love each other. Right. So right before we get started, um, again, I want to thank you for listening to this podcast. Thank you to you guys for subscribing as well. If you're watching this podcast currently via YouTube, please make sure that you like, share, and subscribe to the channel as well as to the podcast as well. Okay. All right. So, a good friend of mine, he was recounting a story that he overheard where a mother um, told her son that I love you, but I don't really like you that much. Right. And so this son has dealt with that idea for many, 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 many years. And my friend was kind of confused and kind of didn't understand how we can love people or how someone can say that they love me don't really like me, you know. um and so like the dynamic between loving someone and liking someone has always been like something that's been really interesting to me because there are several people that I love but I may not be super fond of. And I think part of that, and the reason why that is a frictional situation for me, I think personally, is because I grew up in a religious background, and so I'm commanded to love everybody, right? So like loving people is kind of like my default, right? But there are certain people that I like more than others, and there are some that easily get on my nerves. So is that like a problem with me, right? Is it something that I should work on, or is that perfectly fine? Like, I think it's a fine line between the love like dynamic in our everyday relationships. So, um, I believe one of the obvious keys, I think, for a person that is struggling to like someone that they love is due to trauma, right? Um, Family is chock full of trauma. If you talk to any family, there is some history, some bad history of occurrences, statements, things that have occurred in our family history that has kind of altered how we or shaped, excuse me, how we see one another. And so a lot of times, especially the dynamic between parent and child, right? Um, One thing that I've kind of experienced third party in my family and other families close to me is that you may have some hidden trauma that shows up in how I deal and conversate with you, right? So there may be um, you know let's say you get pregnant but it's not planned, right? And so you had all of these plans and dreams for your life, and yet you have now this pregnancy, and um, sometimes whenever we look in the eyes of our children, and that children is the result of a unwanted pregnancy, then we see what could have been, right, had this situation not happened. And again, none of this is right or wrong. I just know that it happens, right? Or let's say the relationship that birthed this child was toxic, or it ended poorly, right? And so whenever you see this child, sometimes you have memories of the pain, memories of the abuse sometimes, right? And so all of these things, I believe, are the result of unaddressed trauma. Pain is difficult to face because many times we live our lives trying to avoid pain. We live our lives trying to even keep pain from those that we love because we don't want them to experience the same hurt and disappointment that we live with. But sometimes, we have to face these things, especially if whenever I see you, I am reminded of the hurt and the pain, right? No matter how much I'm commanded to love you, like I know that I'm supposed to provide for you. I know that I'm supposed to cover and shelter you. But every once in a while, there's a phrase in the Black community that unfortunately has ripple effects, right? You look like nothing, like you look just like your no good daddy, right? That is a um, kind of a trope, but it's something that I've heard in conversations my entire life growing up, to where every time I look at you, I look at the pain. I don't see my son, I don't see my child. I see the pain that my ex boyfriend, ex husband caused me, and what keeps, I think, um, that pain from ever going away is that we say those things out of anger, out of frustration, but we don't really want to heal in those areas. All right. I don't want to jump the gun too quick, but yeah, trauma a lot of times factors into the like love dynamic, to where I love you, but right now I can't stand you, or for a season of my life, I can't stand you. Another thing I think that pops up a lot is disappointment, and this is typically with older children, and the dynamic with their parents, where where you set this high level of expectation on your children, to where you want your children to grow, you want them to prosper, you want them to be the best versions of themselves, and they fail to do that, or they do something that you believe completely gets them off of the track that you set for them, right? One of my if this doesn't um, if you don't really address that, it turns to resentment. So that every time, you know, we can be in the same house together, but because you've made life choices that are separate or opposite of what I wanted you to make, now I'm mad, and your life is not going down the path that I wanted for you. And so many times we add pressure, unnecessary pressure, on our children whenever we're disappointed in their life choices, right? Um, and so, one of the more popular scriptures in the Bible when it comes to um, training children or raising children is Proverbs 22:6, right? But I want to read it from the Passion Translation, because I think it kind of covers what the goal should be when it comes to raising kids. All right. So it says, dedicate your children to God and point them in the way that they should go. and the values they've learned from you will be with them always. Point them in the way that they should go. Dedicate them to God, but then point them in the way that they should go. Um, a lot of times we set our we set the course for our children without really understanding who they are. Um, one thing that I remember growing up, and I think I've told this in the past, where my father is a master carpenter, and so for me, I knew pretty early because he would always have me help him out. And, I think my first big paycheck was helping him during the summer lay molding in like a 3-story house, right? Good money. But I just realized maybe around 10 or 12 that I just didn't want to do that as a profession, right? And so my grandfather was a carpenter. Of course, my dad's a master carpenter. And so I believe my dad was disappointed that I didn't have the same level of energy, the same interest, and the same passion about what he wanted to do. Um, and what what I think is critical is that we have to get to know our children, right? Get to know what their passions are, get to know what they love to do, what they're good at, right? And then once we kind of figure out what they're good at and what they enjoy, then we point them in that direction, right? But what the one thing that I love about my father, I love about my parents in general, is that they did the first part of that scripture extremely well, which is dedicate your children to God. Setting a proper godly foundation is, I think, one of the most important things that a parent can do for their child. Um, because there were many, many, many moments where I hated going to church. Like I despised going to church because we did it so often. Our lives were, consumed, and everything um, was basically a church trip. Like we went to church 3 times a week, 2 times on Sunday, right? I sang in the choir starting at 12. And then we transitioned churches when I was 16, I did everything in the church. When I say everything, everything. I taught Sunday school. I led praise and worship. Like I did all of these things, helping set up the church. All of these things I did. And there were many, many, many moments where I felt like I was missing out, right? That my life was missing something because I only lived in church. And so I did what a lot of church kids do in my generation, is that once we get outside our parents' house or get outside of an environment that has nothing to do with church, we test stuff, right? But the one thing I will never argue about is that the biblical foundation, the godly foundation that my parents set for me, has lasted my entire life, right? Because no matter how I build my house, if my foundation is solid, it doesn't matter what winds come, what storms come, you know, as long as I have a solid spiritual foundation, I can always rebuild, right? I don't have to tear up a new foundation um, and start from scratch. My foundation with God is set, and I can always rebuild. And it's important that when we keep our children and establish that godly character and godly foundation for them, that they will always have a solid foundation to rebuild, a place to begin again. because the enemy, I believe, especially now, is trying to crack holes in the foundations of our youth. You're trying to establish foundational principles on things outside of God, outside of Jesus Christ, outside um, of the love of godly parents, right? And so my fear is that if we are unable to, introduce Jesus to these children and to these young people, that eventually, whenever they fall, it'll be extremely difficult for some of them to rebuild, right? So that is, I believe, one of the key things when it comes to how we interact as parents to our children. Um, and one of the ways to love somebody that you can't stand is to be truthful about your feelings. Like, be honest and say that you really don't like this person. Because I think without the harsh truth, we'll never start the discovery of asking the question why. Like, why is it that when I see you, I get mad? Why is it when I see you, my blood pressure, goes up? Why am I not able to um, be around you as an adult, right? Why is it that, like, I know that I'm supposed to love you, but I don't want you around me? What is it, right? Um, and so once we address the true reason as to why there's friction and discomfort, then we have to make the choice of if we want to keep it that way or if we want to start the process of healing. All right. Because healing is never for the other person, it's always for us, right? There are some life traumas that are healed, but the relationships may not ever be completely restored. And that's perfectly okay, right? Because that's the one thing about forgiveness, right? I forgive you, so that I'm free of those feelings that every time I see you, I want to punch you in the face, right? I forgive you for whatever you've done, and now you no longer have power over me in this area. You no longer get to dictate how I feel about that situation. Now, what I'm choosing to do is I'm not going to allow you to hurt me again in this way. So, in this part of our relationship, it's not restored in the way that it was. I'm not going to allow you to do that, right? So, we tell the truth about how we feel, and then we choose how we want to proceed. Do we want to be bound by the trauma and bound by the friction of pain and the weight of disappointment? Or do we choose to ask God, okay, Lord, I need you to help me with this, right? Because here's the thing, at the end of the day, if you say you love them, at the very least, you should want to have this issue squashed. At the very least, like, you want to come to a an agreement with yourself that this issue no longer is a problem for me, right? Because loving, we should always love ourselves equally or more so than we love other people, right? Because if we can't love ourselves right, we obviously can't love other people right. And so I think that's one of the ways that we can love people, even if we can't stand them. All right. Because, like I said, it is always possible that in this area of my life, I may never ever be able to trust you again. And so we have to be able to do the work to overcome that. And one final thought And I think it's really really crazy that we have no choice about who our family members are, right? Like we don't get to decide which family God puts us in. But what's interesting about God is that God allows everything to work out for our good. So, like, there is a planned and a purpose behind everything that God does, right? Um, and that's a hard reality to live with. Let's just be real, because it's, God sees the beginning and the end, right? He knows um, the person that we're going to become. And for whatever reason, certain traumas in our lives have to occur in order for us to see the world the way that we see it, in order for us to make necessary changes in our either our relationship with God or our relationship with one another. It's one of the true spiritual paradoxes of life is that it doesn't make sense why God would allow me to have family members that abuse me. It doesn't make any sense for me to have family members who don't like me, who every time I come around, they give me the side eye, right? It doesn't make any sense. Like, um, why wouldn't God put me in a family that everybody love everybody? You know, a utopian type of a scenario. Why wouldn't he do that? Well, you know, we would need God if that was the case. If everything was perfect, we wouldn't have any reason to depend on him and to grow to the person that he wants us to be. All right. So let's trust God that even in our dysfunction, that he eventually is going to work everything out. All right. So that's pretty much all I had today. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. Again, you can find this episode everywhere where podcasts are available. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Good Pods, you have the opportunity there to leave a comment and leave a 5-star um, review as to how well we are doing. Join the community on Good Pods. I'm interested to communicate with you there, how you're liking the podcast, and see if we can grow that there. All right. So until next time, our motto is to live like God, love like God, and have a little fun along the way. Y'all have a great one. Peace.